September 19, 1944, outskirts of Aricourt, France. The fog was still resting heavy on the field when a German commander, a veteran of years on the Eastern Front, opened the hatch of his Panther, convinced of an old certainty. No American vehicle could overcome the Reich's armored engineering. It was a repeated belief in officers' instructions, reports and messes. Those light machines of the enemy, they said, were too fast to be serious and too fragile to be dangerous. That morning he still believed it. This conviction would be broken seconds later. The thesis of this account is born exactly from this instant, the moment when German doctrine found something it had never imagined, a tank destroyer that did not need to withstand enemy fire, because it simply disappeared before the German turret completed half a rotation. The M18 Hellcat triumphed, not by strength but by speed, not by armor but by the industry that created it, not by weight but by the American logic that mobility was more lethal than steel. Throughout this episode, the contrast between what Germany expected to face and what actually collided with its panzers is revealed. A light, cheap, mass-produced machine capable of outperforming its tanks both on the ground and in the very conception of war. In that fog, the hunt changed sides. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story. In just 6 days of combat between September and October 1944, a single battalion of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers destroyed 39 German armor, including Panthers and Tigers, losing only 4 Hellcats in the process. It was not an anomaly. It was the harbinger of a doctrinal collapse. While Germany was investing thousands of man-hours and tons of steel in each vehicle, the United States was producing light, fast and lethal machines at an industrial pace, and they were winning. How did a force considered technically inferior turn the tables against the armored elite of the Reich? If you value the story told with depth, based on data, strategy and factual irony, consider supporting this work. A like, an inscription or a comment helps to keep alive the mission of revealing the wars that happened behind the wars. Because it is a story that Germany never wanted to tell. The German doctrine of armored warfare was born out of the conviction that technical superiority was an almost spiritual guarantee of victory. From the march on Poland to the advance in France and the brutal clashes in the USSR, the Wehrmacht's tanks built a reputation that seemed untouchable, increasingly heavier, more armored, more sophisticated vehicles, capable of facing any enemy head-on and surviving. The Panther, a symbol of this belief, was not just a tank, it was the testimony of a mentality. Its sloped armor, its 75mm long gun, and its low silhouette formed an ensemble that many German officers considered the pinnacle of modern military engineering. Next to it, the Tiger represented the pinnacle of war gigantism. 70 tons of steel designed to dominate any battlefield. In the instruction rooms, the same maxim was repeated: quality beats quantity, technology beats improvisation, precision beats speed. This faith, reinforced by previous victories, had created an echo of invincibility among veterans who had already faced T-34s and KV-1s and survived. No Panzerwaffe commander imagined that the real challenge would come from a vehicle that did not obey any of these rules. As the Western Front advanced, small cracks began to emerge in the structure of this thought. German columns that had previously destroyed heavily armored adversaries now encountered a less visually impressive but alarmingly efficient enemy. The German doctrine had been built to face tanks of the same category, frontal duels, heavy battles. But the enemy that arose in France did not play this game. He appeared, attacked and disappeared. He did not compete for strength. He was fighting for time. He did not seek resistance. He was looking for a position. And above all, it was not a product of German artisanal engineering, but of American industrial pragmatism. In German logic, this seemed almost like an offense. How could something light, assembled on civilian assembly lines, challenge machines designed by elite engineers? The shock began when reports from the front mentioned strange encounters, tanks knocked out by a vehicle that observers could not always identify. Descriptions spoke of a very fast machine, a silhouette too small for a tank, and speed incompatible with American armor. In some cases, crews even believed they were facing a new British model or an American experimental prototype. There was no logic in what they saw. After all, according to his manuals, light vehicles were vulnerable, fragile and unimpressive in real combat, and it was precisely this conviction that prevented many officers from understanding what was coming. German doctrine did not foresee an enemy that would turn mobility into a primary weapon. It did not envisage a tank that prioritized speed over armor, and it did not foresee, above all, that the American industry could produce something that would totally invert the traditional paradigm. At the heart of this surprise was a profound strategic error. Germany believed that the war would be decided by technical excellence, while the United States knew that it would be decided by the ability to produce, maintain, and replace. The Germans devoted 2,000 man-hours to each Panther. The Americans needed about 500 for every M18. Here comes the statistic that many German officers simply ignored. In 1944, total American armor production was about 10 times greater than German. This is one of those numbers that redefine the battlefield. And if this revelation impresses those who watch, it is worth recording in the comments a short phrase that sums up the feeling. Absolute power, unbelievable, shocking data, or logistics wins. Because to understand the fall of the German armored doctrine, it is enough to follow the numbers that it refused to see. German pride rested on machines that were magnificent but too complex for the conditions of the late war. Each Panther represented a feat of engineering, but also a logistical burden. Sensitive engines, fragile transmissions, hydraulic systems that required precision, and equipped workshops. In contrast, the M18 was the expression of American thought, an adapted aircraft engine, automatic transmission inspired by civilian cars, standardized bearings, interchangeable parts, simplified maintenance. What the Germans saw as improvisation was actually the secret to success. The war did not favor who built the most imposing machine, but who built the right machine for the pace of the conflict. The echo of invincibility that had accompanied the panzer divisions began to dissipate when their commanders realized that they were facing a threat that they could not fit within their mental model. The enemy was no longer the tank that was advancing heavily on the front line. It appeared where it shouldn't, attacked at unexpected angles, moved as no German crew imagined possible. It was a war that was not fought by force, but by initiative, and initiative is something that slow machines can't regain once lost. This ideological rupture reaches its apex when Arakort's reports begin to circulate, revealing that Panthers and Tigers were being destroyed by vehicles that, in German theory, should have been eliminated with ease. Officers describe feelings of helplessness, bewilderment, even incredulity. The myth of armored superiority was beginning to crumble, and what would follow, the first full demonstration of how an M18 operated in the field, would make this ruin impossible to ignore. The genesis of the M18 Hellcat did not begin with a distress call from the front, but with an uncomfortable question asked away from the crossfire. Why keep playing the enemy's game? It was at Fort Meade, Maryland, in late 1941, that Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Bruce, newly appointed commander of the Tank Destroyer Training Center, challenged the prevailing dogma. As officers around him studied German reports on the power of the Tigers and Panthers, Bruce noted another detail. Enemy heavy tanks were, first and foremost, slow. He proposed something radical, and for many, heretical. If the goal was to hunt tanks, why not do it with something fast enough to avoid direct contact? Why not build a weapon that would attack and disappear before the enemy even saw it? It was there that the embryo of a concept that denied the very logic of European armored combat was born. Traditional American doctrine still believed in clashes between heavy tanks and fixed front lines, but Bruce saw a new kind of warfare, one based on absolute mobility, accurate shooting, and tactical superiority derived from speed. What would become the M18 was not a response to the Panthers. It was the refusal to recognize them as a valid reference. This revolutionary idea found support where few expected it, in the automobile industry. While German tanks were designed by military engineers, the design of the future M18 was delegated to General Motors' Buick division under the leadership of Harley Earl, the same name responsible for transforming the design of American automobiles. Earl didn't see tanks as mobile fortresses, but as dynamic platforms which were supposed to combine power with fluidity, range with lightness. His design studio in Flint, Michigan, applied the principles of civilian industry to conceive an entirely new vehicle. Narrow chassis, torsion bar suspension, light radial engine, automatic transmission. Everything was designed for a single purpose: speed. While the Panther was built to withstand direct hits, the Hellcat was made to avoid them. While the Tiger needed roads to maintain its mechanical integrity, The M18 was shaped to ride uneven fields like a cat in pursuit. Bruce's philosophy was formalized in Field Manual 18/5. Tank destroyers were to operate in the rear, going into action only when an armored threat was detected. Instead of forming static lines, their platoons would be flexible, mobile, capable of reaching the point of impact with absolute speed. The function of the M18 was not to duel, it was to ambush. This required a light, easy-to-reposition vehicle with superior acceleration and a gun sufficient to penetrate the enemy flank. Armor, by definition, became secondary. For the first time, the doctrine admitted that being hit was not part of the survival equation. The best defense would be to no longer be there when the shot came. The development process was as fast as the philosophy that inspired it. In less than 2 years, the M18 went from the drawing board to the fields of Europe. The first prototypes, under the name T-70, were tested in 1942, and by mid-1943, production models began to roll off the Buick line. Every detail of the vehicle reflected its mission. The Wright R975 radial engine, originally designed for airplanes, delivered between 350 and 400 horsepower, pushing a chassis of only 20 tons. This allowed the Hellcat to reach speeds of up to 89 km/h on the road, a number that turned any German estimate into technical fiction. To give you an idea, the Panther, considered fast among heavy vehicles, reached a maximum of 46 km/h in ideal conditions. The Hellcat did twice as much, and in half the time. But the innovation did not stop at the engine. The turret rotated with almost absurd agility, allowing complete traversals in less than 20 seconds. The smooth suspension made aiming stable even in motion, and the internal layout favored quick communication between the crew. Each Hellcat carried an FM frequency SCR 508 radio, allowing for clear inter-vehicle conversations and real-time tactical coordination. While German crews operated with one radio per platoon and often relied on flags and hand signals, the Hellcat platoons moved around like intelligent swarms, guided by voice, intuition, and doctrine. The structure of the vehicle itself was designed to facilitate maintenance. The engine was mounted on steel rails, allowing it to be removed and replaced in less than 2 hours, a feat unthinkable in German tanks, where the engine change could take more than a day, requiring cranes and structured workshops. The M18 was, in essence, a product of the American industrial mindset, to create a vehicle that was quick to produce, easy to maintain, and good enough to accomplish its mission with mathematical efficiency. The idea was not to create the perfect tank, but rather the perfect logistics system. The Germans still built tanks as works of art. Each Panther was assembled like a Steinway piano. The Americans, on the other hand, built machines like those who build trucks, en masse with standardized parts and ready to be replaced in the field if necessary. This philosophical difference would mark the course of the war in the West. By the end of 1943, Buick factories were producing about 250 Hellcats per month. The number alone was alarming to any German analyst, but few were paying attention. German intelligence still classified the M18 as a variant of the M10, underestimating its speed and treating it as a secondary threat. Such ignorance would be costly, because what was being quietly gestated on American assembly lines was more than a vehicle. It was a rupture, our complete denial of what Germany believed to be the essence of armored warfare. And in September 1944, on the misty plains of Lorraine, this rupture would cease to be a concept and become a reality. The next step in this story occurs when 42 Panthers of the 113th Panzer Brigade advance, confidently, and discover that there is no way to fight a duel with that which refuses to be achieved. The M18 Hellcat's superiority didn't start on the fields of France. It started on Buick's assembly lines in Flint, Michigan. There, far from the front, the Americans made a decision that would seal the fate of hundreds of German tanks, to abandon the technical fetishism of armored warfare and embrace the ruthless logic of modern industry. The Buick Motor Division, a brand traditionally associated with automobile elegance, transformed itself into a center of war innovation by adopting mass production methods applied to combat vehicles. Instead of building tanks as one-off works, as the Germans did with their Panthers and Tigers, the Americans designed the Hellcat to be standardized, simple to assemble, and above all, easy to maintain. The Wright R975 radial engine, originally used in airplanes, was adapted with few modifications. Mounted on steel rails, it could be removed and replaced on the field by a trained team in less than 2 hours, Every detail of the machine obeyed this principle: reduced production time, ease of access, and minimal dependence on scarce materials. The Hellcat's suspension, based on torsion bars, offered a perfect balance between stability and shock absorption. At speeds above 80 km/h, the vehicle maintained shooting accuracy and movement control that cast doubt on the very definition of tank. It was closer to an armed race car than a traditional armored vehicle. The automatic transmission, inherited from General Motors' civilian designs, eliminated the complexity of manual gearboxes, allowing even less experienced drivers to operate the vehicle efficiently under stress. While the Panthers required dual-clutch gear changes and precise timing, tasks that became nearly impossible in combat, the Hellcat offered smoothness and agility. Everything about it was designed to work fluidly: the steering wheel, the turret crossing, the suspension maintenance, the quick change of ammunition. A vehicle made not only to fight, but to keep fighting. In practice, this meant that the Hellcat was much more than a light and fast machine. He was replicable, and this replicability hid the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal: constancy. At their peak production, Buick factories produced up to 250 units per month. Each Hellcat required approximately 500 man-hours to complete. The Panther, with its heavy engineering and bespoke components, consumed an average of 2,000 man-hours, a ratio of 4-to-1. This meant that for every Panther Germany fielded, the United States could deliver 4 Hellcats, without overloading its productive capacity. What's more, while the Germans needed highly skilled workers, the production of the Hellcat used factory floor-trained labor, often women who had left homes for hangars. This ability to produce at scale made the M18 become an invisible piece of American strategy. Invisible, because he was rarely presented as the center of operations. Its function was to look small, to look light, to look harmless, until the moment of impact. And when it did, the consequence was lethal. The 2-ton turret rotated faster than any Allied or enemy tank. Its 76mm gun, while not rivaled in sheer power with the Tiger's 80mm gun, was more than enough to pierce the side or rear of any German armor. And since the Hellcat never attacked head-on, that was the only statistic that really mattered. In the field, it was rarely detected before firing, and it rarely remained in the same spot after the shot. The contrast with the Panther could not be greater. The German tank was the ultimate symbol of detailed engineering. Its Maybach engine, assembled by hand, required constant maintenance and specialized access. Its turret, weighing nearly 7 tons, took up to 60 seconds to complete a full rotation, enough time for an M18 to spawn, flank, fire, and disappear. Even in ideal conditions, the Panther's top speed barely exceeded 45 km/h, and off the roads, its performance dropped dramatically. The Hellcat, on the other hand, even on uneven terrain, could maintain speeds of more than 60 km/h without risk of overheating or structural failure. The German running system, with interlocking wheels and leaf springs, made any quick displacement a logistical risk. Meanwhile, the Hellcats traversed open fields lightly, connected by radio, exchanging information in real time and adjusting their positions like ever-changing mechanical swarms. This efficiency model was not just technical, he was philosophical. The United States was not trying to win armored warfare with a supertank. They were redesigning the rules of the game, and these new rules favored agility, replacement, and adaptation, qualities that Germany could no longer keep up with. One American official summed it up as pragmatically as possible: "They make steel tanks, we make steel tanks, and then 10 more of the same in record time." By the time the Buick assembly line stopped due to maintenance, the Americans had already produced enough to cover the losses of an entire month of combat. And the most ironic? Many German commanders, upon capturing intact Hellcats, still refused to accept them as a real threat. Lightness was confused with fragility, speed with impulsiveness, the absence of armor with inferiority. It was as if German doctrine was stuck in the image of the ideal tank, and not in the function it was supposed to fulfill. Such a refusal to understand the enemy would be costly, because by the time the Panthers advanced toward Aracourt in September 1944, every one of those illusions would be shattered, not by direct confrontation, but by tactics the Germans were not even prepared to imagine, and before they even realized what was happening, tank warfare would have changed its name. It was now a mobility war, a war of rhythm, and in that game the M18 was absolute. The final irony? In less than 2 days of production, the United States could replace all the Hellcats lost in that battle. For Germany, each Panther destroyed was a week less of industrial breath, and this equation, silent, was about to collide with the fog. The 113th Panzer Brigade was confidently advancing through the misty field of Lorraine at dawn on September 19, 1944. They were hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, experienced in combat against T-34s and entire Soviet armies. Now, faced with American forces, they believed they were facing an ill-trained enemy, supported by inferior tanks and lax doctrine. His Panthers cut through the mist with Maybach engines rumbling rhythmically, turrets vaguely scouring the flanks, but unhurriedly, because doctrine still told them they had the upper hand. Ahead, no visible resistance, no defensive line, no artillery signaled, only silence. But the silence there was a carefully constructed deception. The American trap was set with mathematical precision. Positioned on high ground, hidden among woods and subtle reliefs, were the M18 Hellcats of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Radio-connected, receiving coordinates from infantry and forward observers, the Hellcats had no intention of opening fire en masse. They waited for each target like a hunter waits for the right moment to pull the trigger. And when the first Panther appeared in the field of fire, side exposed, turret still rotating, the shot came dry, direct, destructive. The 76mm shell penetrated through the thin side of the German armored vehicle and set it on fire. The German columns stopped for seconds, confused, but there was no time to understand. Other shots began to pop up from different angles. What looked like a single shot turned out to be a coordinated attack by dozens of Hellcats, acting as an organic unit. The Panthers tried to react, but they were in the open. Its slow turrets couldn't lock onto such nimble targets, and each attempt to turn exposed the rear even more. The Germans expected direct confrontations but faced ghosts. With each shot, the Hellcats retreated, switched positions, regrouped by radio, and attacked again. They used their own enemy arrogance as a weapon. The 113th Panzer Brigade did not face tanks. He faced a new kind of war, mobile, invisible, impossible to anticipate. German officers, surrounded by smoke and confusion, tried to reorganize the formations. But the doctrine they knew offered no answers. In Guderian's theory, the superiority of the armored vehicle ensured the advance. But in that wet terrain, covered by fog and riddled with ambushes, the armor had become a burden. With each attempt to advance, the Panthers stumbled over swampy terrain, were exposed in narrow clearings, and became easy targets for artillery that they didn't even know where it was coming from. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them, but they were stuck in their own past glory. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. Because these hidden battles reveal much more than what is taught in books. Within hours, the Aracourt front was transformed into a German steel cemetery. Many of the Panthers didn't even fire a single shot. Some were knocked out before their towers completed 90 degrees. The fog that seemed to cover the Panzerwaffe's movements actually served to mask the collapse of its doctrine. A German commander, still stunned after escaping the destruction, would later write in his diary, "We do not fight tanks. We fought shadows that shot accurately from a rifle and disappeared like smoke." The pride of the Panzerwaffe, hitherto unquestioned, was beginning to crumble, not in the face of a stronger force, but in the face of a more adapted force. And in the coming days, the battlefield would show a count that even Americans did not expect. Their statistic would emerge from the fog, and it would turn Aracourt into a definitive case study in how to destroy a doctrine with mobility. During the fighting at Aracourt, it became clear that the M18 Hellcat was not simply a combat vehicle. It represented a new philosophy of armored warfare. His doctrine did not provide for frontal confrontations or prolonged exchanges of fire. He didn't seek resistance. He sought quick, invisible elimination. The operating manuals, especially Field Manual 18-5, made it clear. The Hellcat was to operate as a pack hunter. The essence was absolute mobility. The vehicle that kept moving was the one that survived. What's more, what moved in a coordinated way, connected to others by radio, dominated the field. The platoons operated with mobile ambush tactics. One vehicle drew fire, revealed the enemy's position, while 2 or 3 others flanked it from unexpected angles. The light turret allowed for fast traversals, and visual range was maximized by elevated positions and constant movement. American doctrine in this sense was adaptive, almost organic. Instead of following rigid formations, it reacted to the field in real time, and that real time was guaranteed by the SCR 508 FM radio, which each Hellcat carried as part of its nervous system. Communication between vehicles happened with clarity and immediacy. A unit under fire could, within seconds, redraw its position, call for cover, organize a secondary ambush and escape. The Germans, on the other hand, operated under a centralized and restricted communication system. Many tanks had only one radio for reception. That is, they received orders but could not respond to them. Coordination between platoons depended on visual signals, flags, messengers, or guesswork. In dynamic combat, this lag was fatal. The Panthers took precious minutes to understand what was happening. When they reacted, the Hellcats were no longer there. The battlefield was transformed into a board where the Americans controlled time and geometry. They decided where to attack, when to retreat, where to reappear. The thin armor of the Hellcat, which in other contexts would be a weakness, became irrelevant because his doctrine prevented him from being affected. The logic was simple. If you can move fast enough and if you can coordinate your movements with an accuracy of seconds, then protection becomes a statistical illusion. The Germans bet on survival by physical endurance, the Americans for evasion and accuracy. The difference between these approaches was clear at Aracourt. While the Panthers absorbed gunfire trying to survive, the Hellcats attacked and hid before the enemy even aimed. A post-battle report from the 704th Battalion reports that no significant losses occurred through tactical failure. The losses were caused by unforeseeable circumstances or terrain errors. This reveals something essential. The doctrine functioned not as a theory, but as a field practice. Each platoon was trained to operate as an independent but interconnected cell. The Hellcat network was, in effect, a decentralized combat system, something that Germany, with its high degree of centralization and hierarchy, was never able to replicate. The psychological impact of this approach was overwhelming. German veterans reported increasing confusion when trying to locate an enemy who refused to take a clear position. A Panzerwaffe company commander, a survivor of Aracourt, later wrote that the Americans fired as if they had eyes on our backs. Our every move was anticipated. This sense of constant vigilance, combined with the impossibility of immediate response, eroded the morale of the German crews. It wasn't just a matter of losing armor. It was the realization that they were being hunted by an invisible, fast-moving intelligence. This invisible speed redefined armored combat on the Western Front. The function of the tank, until then conceived as a spearhead, was transformed into a mobile ambush and retreat unit. The M18 was not used to break through lines, but to empty enemy space. It was a chess piece that sacrificed strength to master time, and it is in time that the war is decided. Because while the Germans spent hours trying to reposition their Panthers, the Americans had already attacked, retreated, rearmed, and returned to action. While Reich engineers tweaked sensitive transmissions, Buick mechanics swapped engines with ordinary keys. While German generals demanded detailed reports and maps, American sergeants exchanged radio coordinates and decided ambushes within minutes. It was an asymmetrical war, not in firepower, but in mentality. And when the mindset changes, even the best tanks can become obsolete. This doctrinal obsolescence was evident in the post-battle period. Of the dozens of Panthers sent to the offensive at Aracourt, many were abandoned intact, without fuel, without support, without aim. The Hellcats, even damaged, were recovered, repaired, and put back in action in a matter of days. In one recorded case, an M18 with engine failure was towed, had the engine changed, and returned to the front less than 48 hours later. This real-time replenishment capability was the ultimate trump card of American doctrine, because it was not enough to win the fight. It was necessary to be ready for the next one, and the next one came quickly. Behind the scenes of the American victory at Aracourt, there was more than gunfire and maneuvering. There was the victory of adaptation over rigidity, of mobility over the mass, of the net over pride. And at the center of this transformation was a machine that many Germans had not even learned to identify correctly. The M18 didn't just win duels, he won the very concept of dueling. And in the next part of this story, we'll look at how the Germans tried to fight back, and how their attempts, however desperate, ran into an even more impenetrable barrier: American logistics. Because speed was not just the vehicles, it was the whole system, and this system was just beginning to show its scale. On paper, the Panther was a masterpiece of German military engineering. Sloped frontal armor, 75mm KWK 42L70 gun with high penetrating power, 700 horsepower Maybach engine. A tank designed to defeat the Soviet T-34, not only in combat but in concept. He was the Reich's answer to mechanized warfare, firepower, resistance, and presence in the field. But real war rarely respects the promises of the drawing board, and at Aracourt, the Panther faced his most lethal enemy. Not the Hellcat itself, but the scenario where his doctrine became irrelevant. The first weakness was mechanical. The final drives, the final sets of gear responsible for transmitting the power of the engine to the caterpillars, proved chronically fragile. Designed for a lower load, they failed under continuous stress, especially in rough terrain. In at least 5 documented episodes, Panthers were abandoned on the field after complete breaks in the broadcast during Hellcat chases that disappeared up the hill. The Panther's weight, in excess of 45 tons, required a robust propulsion system, but the project, rushed after the Russian campaign, never corrected this mechanical heel. The result, stationary, vulnerable tanks, becoming easy targets for artillery or sabotage. The second weakness was the tower. Weighing almost 7 tons, its crossing was slow, even with motorized assistance. In combat against moving targets, such as the M18, which appeared and disappeared in seconds, this slowness turned the precision cannon into a dull piece. Experienced crews knew this. When identifying fast vehicles, German commanders were required to rotate the entire chassis to adjust the angle of fire, a time-consuming procedure that exposed the armor's flank. This maneuver, in addition to being inefficient, increased the wear and tear of the components and left the vehicle vulnerable to sidefire, exactly the favorite tactic of the Hellcats. German doctrine, based on head-on engagement and superior firepower, was simply not prepared for fast hunters who avoided all direct engagements. The Panther was made to win force combats, but it was being defeated by a rhythm war. The most serious, however, was the psychological breakdown. Veteran crews who had survived battles in and around Kursk began to distrust the machine itself. There was something deeply disturbing about seeing a light vehicle, without significant armor, destroy Panthers so consistently. German tankers have come to suspect their invulnerability, and when that conviction is lost, more than steel is lost. The spirit is lost. The doctrine that taught that one Panther was worth 3 enemy tanks now faced reports of entire battalions dismantled by vehicles that could barely withstand a heavy machine gun barrage. And even more alarming, the enemy knew it. The Americans exploited this psychological advantage with surgical precision. They ambushed, disappeared, appeared on unlikely flanks, and destroyed without warning. Uncertainty has become part of the German routine. The battlefield was no longer dominated by what was seen, but by what was not seen. This destabilization was aggravated by the constant comparison between realities. While the Panther relied on high-octane fuel and specialized maintenance, the Hellcat operated on regular gasoline and could be serviced by any trained mechanic on the assembly line. With each Panther lost, the Reich saw not just a vehicle disappear, but an absurd concentration of resources, time, and hope. A tank that in itself represented weeks of industrial effort, strategic materials, and transport logistics. In contrast, the M18 was light enough to be transported en masse, loaded onto trains, trucks, and even gliders if necessary. The difference was not only in the machine, but in the ability to continue fighting after each fight. And that, in the end, was what really decided the war. The Americans understood that a tank that does not reach the front is just dead weight. Therefore, each Hellcat produced was thought of as part of a chain: production, shipping, maintenance, replacement. American industry did not manufacture tanks, it manufactured systems, and these systems swallowed up German pride with the coldness of an assembly line. A Wehrmacht commander summed up the sentiment with a bitter phrase, written weeks after Aracourt: "We didn't lose to tanks, we lose to the way they raised them." It was the recognition that behind the battlefield there was an invisible war, and that in it the Reich was losing. The consequence was devastating. The Panther, a symbol of technical pride, has also become the symbol of doctrinal limits. A brilliant machine in concept, but isolated in its own logic. In camps like Aracourt, this logic was crushed not by superior armor, but by tactical and industrial intelligence. The war had changed, and many German officers still refused to accept this. But the next revelation would make that refusal impossible, because while the Panthers burned in the French fog, the numbers arriving at the high command exposed an untenable truth. In 6 days, a battalion of Hellcats had destroyed the equivalent of an entire regiment of the Reich's armored elite, and those numbers were about to be broken down, line by line. Arakort's impact was not limited to the battlefield. It reverberated at the heart of German doctrine. Over the next few days, reports began to pour in at the headquarters of the 5th Panzer Army, commanded by Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most respected armored warfare experts. Manteuffel, a veteran of operations in the USSR, immediately recognized something that many officers refused to admit. The Panthers were not losing because of technical inferiority. They were losing because they faced a form of combat for which they were never designed. In his analysis, Manteuffel identified the decisive point. Every pursuit against the Hellcats ended in disaster. The Panthers, slow to accelerate, too heavy for uneven terrain, and lacking efficient communication, were drawn into ambushes in sequence. With each hasty advance, another Panther was destroyed by a quick invisible weapon. Thus, in a decision that shocked even his most confident subordinates, Manteuffel issued a clear order: do not pursue enemy vehicles of high mobility, not engaging in mobile battles. This seemingly simple phrase represented the silent death of the German belief in the armored offensive. Tanks created to break through lines were now forbidden to move freely. In practical terms, the Panzerwaffe was being pushed into a defensive role, the one its creators had always feared. German doctrine, once aggressive and dynamic, now had to adapt to an enemy that dictated the pace. The Reich armored units, which had previously been the steel hammer of the offensives, turned into static strongholds, forced to wait for the enemy and react rigidly. This regression was visible in internal reports. Crews asked for permission to hold positions, complained about the lack of radio between vehicles, reported mechanical failures that prevented rapid repositioning. Officers tried to reorganize their tactics, but faced a brutal reality. Every Hellcat destroyed could be replaced by American industry in a few hours. Each Panther lost was a deep and almost irreparable blow. At this point in history, it is worth highlighting a statistic that Germany simply ignored. In 1944, the United States produced almost 1/200 armored vehicles per month, while Germany barely reached 300. This disparity wasn't just numerical, it was structural. And if this difference impresses those who watch, it is worth noting in the comments a short phrase like absolute power, unbelievable, shocking data, or logistics wins. German reports became even more unsettling when field officials admitted that the Hellcats arrived in combat before their Panthers were in position. The enemy, they claimed, moved with a speed incompatible with armored vehicles. Some commanders began to suggest that the Americans were using British shoot-and-scoot tactics, but they were amplified to a level never seen before. The reality was simple: there was no answer. Germany was still trying to operate its Panthers as offensive spears, but faced an opponent who did not offer a fixed target, and every movement of the Hellcats was coordinated by radio, something the Germans couldn't match. The German rigidity, which had so often worked in previous years, now proved to be a sentence of gradual defeat. The American ability to adapt was not only in doctrine, but also in logistics. The Hellcats operated in conjunction with Shermans, mechanized infantry, artillery, and air units, creating an integrated system that the Germans had never faced in the East. Manteuffel understood the gravity of this new reality, but he did not have the means to face it. The Reich no longer had enough fuel, enough skilled labor, or the industrial capacity to reinvent itself in time. For the first time since the beginning of the war, panzers did not dictate combat. They just reacted, and they reacted late. This silent admission of powerlessness marked an irreversible turn. The German armored offensive was broken. The initiative now belonged to the Americans, and on the modern battlefield, it is the initiative that decides who lives and who dies. In the next part, we will see how far this shift has gone as the United States has come to use not just speed, but total coordination as a strategic weapon. Because the Hellcats didn't fight alone. They fought within a system that Germany could never match. In 1944, as Germany struggled to keep its production lines intact under constant bombardment and resource shortages, the United States operated like a sleepless factory. In Flint, Michigan, Buick delivered a full Hellcat every 24 minutes on the assembly line. A light, agile, standardized vehicle that could be loaded onto trains, trucks, or ships without the slightest complexity. An M18 lost in combat was just another item to be replaced, not a logistical tragedy. In cold numbers, replacing a Hellcat took about 2 days between production, testing, and shipping. The Panther, on the other hand, required at least 7 working days just to roll off the line, not to mention shipping delays and parts shortages. The difference was abysmal. On average, the Hellcat consumed 500 man-hours. The Panther, on the other hand, between manual adjustments and minimum engineering tolerances, easily exceeded 2,000 hours per unit. The American logic was not to win by the strongest machine, but by the most replicable machine. And replicability means continuity, the ability to keep a force operating even after severe losses. This turned the fights into a game of attrition where the United States had a structural advantage. Each confrontation was a simple equation: how many vehicles can be fielded tomorrow? The Germans invested in millimeter precision, but paid with delay, rigidity, and industrial vulnerability. Their tanks required high-quality steel, skilled labor, and near-artisanal assembly lines. The failure of one component, such as a clutch or a vision telescope, could delay dozens of units. The Americans, on the other hand, standardized parts, shared components between models, and maintained spare parts warehouses in advanced zones. The Hellcat was not an isolated machine. It was part of a logistics ecosystem that predicted failures, accepted losses, and kept flowing. This meant that the combat power of the United States was cumulative, while that of Germany was dissipative. With each Panther lost, the Panzerwaffe took one step closer to collapse. With each Hellcat destroyed, American industry only turned one more gear, and there was the cost. In dollars at the time, the M18 cost about $5,500 per unit. The Panther, even with conservative estimates, exceeded $120,000, a ratio of 2 to 1. But the real impact was on the cost of maintenance and operation. The Panthers required larger crews, special fuels, and heavy transports for strategic commuting. The Hellcat, with its radial engine of aeronautical origin, operated on regular gasoline, could be towed by trucks and loaded easily. In some cases, it was repaired on the battlefield itself with standard tools. Maintenance didn't depend on engineers, it depended on logistics. And in this, the Americans had become masters. Their convoys carried not only ammunition, but extra engines, radio systems, spare turrets, and even full tracks. The time between a breakdown and the return to the front was measured in hours. The Germans, on the other hand, increasingly isolated, saw their Panthers turn into irrecoverable carcasses for lack of a single component. This advantage was amplified when the whole was observed. The United States was the only country at war capable of fighting 2 simultaneous global wars in the Pacific and Europe, and still maintaining strategic stockpiles of vehicles ready for shipment. Production did not respond only to the immediate need, she anticipated the future. By the time the Western Front advanced, the Hellcats were already being loaded onto trains. When a battalion suffered losses, replacements were already on the way. The scale was the real trump card, and in this game of scale, Germany was doomed. Bombarded by the day, squeezed by lack of resources, and trapped in a production model that did not tolerate mistakes, she became a victim of her own search for perfection. The final irony? The German obsession with invincible tanks spawned machines that could not be replicated en masse. The Americans, on the other hand, by accepting functional imperfections, built a system that could not be stopped. The Hellcat was not invulnerable. He was not the strongest, not even the best armored, but he was always there. And in war, constant presence is synonymous with dominance. By the end of 1944, American factories had already delivered more than 2,500 units of the M18. Many of these machines were destroyed. Many have been repaired, but they all fulfilled their function: to keep up the pressure, to sustain the advance, to destroy the myth of German technical superiority. In the next part, we will see how this machine, designed as a tank destroyer, began to take on even more audacious roles: anti-aircraft defense, infantry support, convoy interception. Because when a machine is created within an intelligent system, its limits are no longer technical, and they become only strategic. On the battlefield, covered in smoke and surprise, there was an American weapon that did not fire projectiles, but that decided every death and every survival: the radio. Specifically the SCR-508, installed in virtually all M18 Hellcats. While the Germans still relied on tactical doctrines that treated each tank as an autonomous unit, connected only to the nearest company commander or platoon, the Americans operated with a completely different logic. Each Hellcat was a nest within a net, not a symbolic network, but a functional real mesh, capable of coordinating ambushes, retreats, sieges, and responses in real time. The SCR-508 operated at frequency modulation, with a range of more than 10 miles, 16 kilometers, in open terrain and could switch between 3 active channels and a permanent listening function. This meant that a platoon of Hellcats, even dispersed over several miles of uneven terrain, could act as a single sensitive, adaptive, synchronized unit. A shot on a hill could be followed seconds later by a flanking from a side bush, all without a single messenger having to run under fire. The superiority of this communication was evident in Aracourt. In one of the most frequently cited episodes in post-battle reports, an advance patrol of M18s identified a group of Panthers attempting to cross a narrow valley. In traditional doctrine, the patrol was supposed to retreat and report. But there, within seconds, a second group of Hellcats received the Panthers' exact position via radio, changed direction, positioned themselves high on a side elevation, and opened fire with complete visibility and angle advantage. There was no pause for the decision of command. There was no hesitation. The battlefield reconfigured itself in real time, and the Germans were caught on the wrong foot once again. This pattern was repeated. The Americans didn't just attack fast, they thought fast, or rather they thought together. German communication, on the other hand, was a portrait of the Prussian hierarchy, centralized, slow, and limited. Most tanks only had a radio receiver, and in many cases, not even that. Commanders received orders, but they could not pass on updates quickly. Visual signs and flags were still used in the middle of World War II. In dynamic confrontations, where every second decided between survival and destruction, this limitation was fatal. The Panthers didn't know where the shots were coming from, and the most serious, they could not inform each other of this. At each attempt to react, they were already surrounded. Or worse, they were alone, abandoned by the time of the doctrine itself. This gap between communication capabilities has redefined the very nature of armored warfare. The Hellcat was fast, but its true speed was cognitive. It moved in the time of the radio, not the engine. The combination of physical mobility with informational mobility created a new type of combat unit, decentralized but coordinated, light but strategic. And the radio was the invisible link that kept all this going. Each successful ambush was not just the result of good aim or luck of terrain, it was the result of a collective decision, made in an instant and executed with surgical precision. This made the Americans, literally, a fighting organism, a band of hunters who shared eyes, ears, and instinct. In the reports of the German High Command, terms such as synchronized mobile warfare and spectral attacks appear for the first time to describe the movements of the Hellcats. German intelligence began to try to track not only the tanks, but the communication patterns, something that, by the way, would also prove useless. The Americans changed frequencies, operated with simple codes, and maintained redundancy in all platoons. Even under fire, even with losses, the network remained functional, and all the while the Panthers burned alone, waiting for orders that never came in time. The philosophical difference between the two sides was clear. The Germans believed in precision and control. The Americans bet on agility and adaptation. Germany relied on tanks that were almost invincible. The United States, in tanks that could die and be replaced, repositioned, reconfigured. The Panther was a machine. The Hellcat was a system. And this system was connected by radio. This invisible technology, this sound that crossed the air without being seen, was the watershed. Most German generals have never seen an SCR-508, but everyone saw the results he generated. A Wehrmacht commander, after capturing American technical documents, noted in his diary, "Now I understand. They do not surpass us in armor. They surpass us in coordination. Each of them seems to know where we are before we know where they are." The war at that point had already been transformed, and the machine that the Germans feared so much, the Hellcat, was just the visible tip of a logistical, technological, and organizational iceberg that moved in tandem. But this radio network, this tactical and industrial network, was just beginning to show its true reach. Because in the coming months the Americans would further integrate their tanks with planes, infantry, and artillery. and what started with tank destroyers would turn into a total doctrine of combined warfare. A doctrine that would make any German reaction obsolete. Among the numerous factors that explained the tactical success of the M18 Hellcat, one of the least visible and most decisive was the way the American crews learned to read the terrain, not as obstacles, but as opportunities. In the rolling fields of Lorraine, on the forested roads of Alsace, on the jagged ridges of the Meurthe et Moselle, American tanks didn't just pass by, they hid, waited, popped up, and disappeared as part of the landscape. The Fort Benning doctrine taught that the first weapon of a tank destroyer was relief, narrow valleys, dense woods, trail detours, vegetation, shade, fog. Everything was interpreted as cover and maneuver. Instead of imposing their presence like the Panthers, who relied on long sightlines and firm ground, the Hellcats thrived on asymmetry. The American doctrine did not treat the soil as something to be overcome, but as a strategic ally. And that sight proved devastating to the Germans. Panther crews reported in panic that the shots were coming from nowhere. A seemingly empty hill turned into a firemouth, a forest in an ambush, a rural crossing in a mobile trap. The Hellcats positioned themselves not where the enemy expected, but where American logic predicted that the enemy would not think to look. It was the use of geography as a system of invisibility. More than that, American tactical training valued team instinct. Each platoon commander was trained to study maps, memorize elevations, estimate angles, and interpret shadow and terrain as part of the lethality of firing. A Hellcat didn't just fire with the cannon, it fired with the ground under its tracks. This conceptual difference shaped the battlefield. The Panthers, with their frontal armor and long-range gun, sought to engage the enemy in open fields where they could use their strength in a straight line. But the actual battlefield was jagged, fragmented, broken into unpredictable reliefs. And in this type of terrain, the weight of the Panther became a burden. On muddy slopes, they were vulnerable. On narrow trails, they were slow to maneuver. On wooded grounds, his tower rotated too late. The Hellcats, on the other hand, appeared where no one expected, fired, retreated 20 meters in reverse, and disappeared. And they did it not by chance, but by training. An American combat manual described the principle with mathematical coldness. Position yourself where the enemy will not see your barrel. Shoot, move before the echo stops. This turned each encounter into an asymmetrical game. A 44-ton tank, designed to break columns, was being hunted by a 17-ton vehicle, guided not by armor but by geography and speed. What the Germans did not understand was that American doctrine had incorporated terrain as an offensive factor. It wasn't just the use of the soil for cover, it was the deliberate creation of death zones, areas where the Hellcats knew the enemy would be forced to pass, slow down, turn, and in that span of seconds, die. And most ironically, this doctrine was not new. It was an adaptation of Native American warfare, reintroduced into military manuals after guerrilla studies and hunter tactics. The Americans rediscovered their own history to build a method that turned the field into weaponry. The German accounts are almost desperate. In more than one documented instance, Panthers entered areas already cleared of infantry and support, only to be destroyed by gunfire from unmapped slopes. In one particular episode, in Bois de Bézange, 3 Hellcats were positioned in an inverted semicircle in a concave clearing. When the German armored column entered, believing in full visibility, it was fired upon from 3 sides simultaneously before any Panther guns had time to line up their sights. It wasn't luck, it was a soil calculation. In modern warfare, the map has replaced heroism, and the Americans had already understood this. The tactical superiority of the M18, therefore, was not only in its speed, it was in the fact that this speed was applied with accurate reading of space. In unprepared hands, it would only be impulsiveness. In well-trained platoons, it became predation. It was not a fleeing vehicle. It was a predator that chose the moment, the place, and the angle. The metaphor was not of a tank. It was an ambush in motion. A Hellcat was, in essence, a radial-engined ambusher. And the terrain, his auxiliary weapon, the Wehrmacht, accustomed to the doctrine of deep penetration, found itself paralyzed. He couldn't predict the Hellcats because he didn't understand the logic that guided them. They did not defend positions. They did not maintain a line. They did not settle in trenches. They flowed. They disappeared. And more than anything, They knew exactly where the Panthers would be forced to go. German armored superiority was not destroyed by steel alone. It was dismantled by the ground, and that, for a doctrine based on advancement and visibility, was humiliation. In the next part, we will see the result of this combination of speed, radio, and terrain, battles won with unlikely numbers, where small units caused devastating losses to much superior forces, because ultimately, tank warfare is no longer a contest of strength, and it became a competition of tactical intelligence. And in this game, the M18 Hellcat had something that no Panther could match: total dominance of the unseen. American combat logic in 1944 did not see its tanks as isolated entities. I saw them as instruments within a much larger organism, where each unit fulfilled a specific and complementary role. While German doctrine often employed Panthers and Tigers in relatively autonomous armored columns, relying on brute strength, armor, and the initiative of the local commander, the U.S. Army operated as a multi-phase machine, where every movement was amplified by an interdependent chain of support. In Aracourt and in the following offensives, this difference became crystal clear. Shermans advanced ahead in large formations, not because they were the strongest tanks, but because their function was different: to attract attention, fix the enemy's line of sight, provoke the initial fire, and reveal the position of the Panthers. The infantry followed closely, consolidating every piece of ground, clearing pockets of resistance, and preventing German scouts from identifying the vulnerable flanks. And when the panorama was forming, when the Panthers exposed themselves by focusing on the supposed center of gravity of the American force, it was at that moment that the Hellcats emerged, not as loose units, but as the blade needs a surgical hand. This gear worked because each element fulfilled its role in synchrony. American artillery, extremely efficient at radio correction calculations, shaped German movements, bombarding roads, crossing areas, and supply routes. None of this happened by improvisation. It was an operational architecture that made the battlefield a controlled arena. Amid the advance, the Hellcats waited in slightly retreated positions, always outside the direct line of initial contact. When a Panther engaged a Sherman head-on, one imagines that this would be the moment of German advantage. However, this was exactly the moment calculated by the Americans. The Sherman, while vulnerable, didn't need to win. It was enough to survive long enough for his radio to broadcast, "Enemy fixed, flank exposed." That phrase, within seconds, traveled to every Hellcat in the area, and like arrows launched from the same bow, they converged laterally. The Germans, accustomed to head-on duels, often did not understand what was happening until their tanks were already under fire. For the Panzerwaffe, it was incomprehensible that lighter, more fragile, and theoretically inferior vehicles could operate with such precision. In their reports, descriptions such as coordinated attacks from 3 directions and synchronized movements impossible for enemy units of this size emerge. What seemed like an impossibility was in fact method. A method sustained by logistics, training, communication, and a doctrine that treated war as a whole, never as a duel. In one episode documented east of Jubilees, 3 Shermans positioned themselves in a seemingly naive manner in the open. They knew they would be sighted. They knew the Panthers would advance. They knew that the first enemy salvo would come with devastating power. Its role was to survive the first impact and keep moving, swinging the chassis to distort the German aim. It only took 40 seconds of fixation for 2 platoons of Hellcats to be on the move. The infantry, in the distance, fired mortars to obscure the opposite flank, creating the illusion of a secondary advance. When the Panthers tried to adjust their positions, the Hellcats emerged from the sidelines, each firing a single round before disappearing behind the vegetation. 20 minutes later, 4 Panthers were destroyed, and no Hellcats had been detected during the attack. A German commander summed up the experience: "We don't fight tanks, we fight against a coordinated body." It is at this point that the statistic that the Germans never accepted emerges. The United States had, in that period, more than 300,000 military radios in operation, while Germany had just over 30,000. This 10-to-1 ratio wasn't just a number, it was the difference between a force that thought together and one that thought piecemeal. And if this communication discrepancy makes clear the size of the chasm between the 2 war machines, it is worth noting in the comments words like absolute power, unbelievable, shocking data, or logistics wins, because these numbers literally decided battles. With this structure, the battlefield became a choreography. The Shermans moved like shields, The infantry acted as eyes on the ground. The artillery shaped the opponent's space, and the Hellcats, fast, lethal, and invisible, executed the final blow. The Panther was a lone gladiator, exceptional in duels. The Hellcat was a scalpel within an entire medical system, a vehicle that would not survive alone, but that, within the right gear, became devastating. This model of combined arms was more than technique. It was an operational philosophy that Germany simply could not replicate in 1944, and yet this was only the beginning, because while the Germans were trying to understand how they were losing battles to smaller units, the Americans were already preparing an even deeper change, a strategic fusion of mobility, communication, and air power, something that would transform the Hellcat not only into a tank hunter, but into a point of connection between land and sky. From the next part on, the battlefield will cease to be two-dimensional and will become three-dimensional. At the end of each battle, Wehrmacht reports recorded material losses, tanks destroyed, ammunition expended, positions lost. But there was a loss that did not appear in columns or graphs, a type of damage that corroded from the inside out, and that, in the weeks after Aracourt, would begin to spread like a virus among German crews: the collapse of trust. Veterans who had fought the T-34s at Kursk, which had survived the Soviet winters, began to describe a new kind of enemy, not by what they saw, but by what they didn't see. The Hellcat did not perform. He insinuated himself. It was not faced, it was felt. He appeared on the flank, shot once, disappeared, and left a trail of paranoia. A platoon commander of the 11th Panzer Regiment wrote after an ambush, "We don't fight tanks. We fight against shadows that move as if they know us before they see us." This invisible terror altered behaviors. German commanders began to hesitate when advancing into areas with dense vegetation. Armored units called for infantry reinforcement to sweep before crossing valleys or clearings. The reaction time increased, aggressiveness decreased, and hesitation in armored combat is the death sentence. In previous engagements, the Panthers had begun attacks with confidence, certain of their superiority in range and armor. After the first clashes with Hellcats, this confidence turned to caution. Each advance could be an invitation to side slaughter. Each silence could hide a coordinated shot. The battlefield ceased to be a scene of strength and became a labyrinth of mental traps. The impact was more than individual. It was systemic. The doctrine of the Panzerwaffe had been built on offensive morale. The idea that shock power came from initiative, speed, and tactical superiority. When a crew hesitates, that doctrine crumbles. And the Hellcat, with its attack and disappear method, neutralized just that: confidence in advancement. It didn't matter the number of cannons. It mattered how long it took the commander to decide whether to advance or retreat. When that time lengthened, the flank was already exposed. And the flank was always the Panthers' weak point. Testimonies collected after the war reveal the depth of this trauma. A commander of the 116th Panzer Division reported that the Hellcat seemed to read our intentions. The phrase is not literal. It's the emotional translation of the feeling of powerlessness, the idea that the enemy already knows where you're going to be and is waiting for you. It is no longer a technical duel. It is the collapse of operational logic. In a war where the speed of the decision defines who lives, doubt kills. And the Hellcat installed doubt in every dense forest, every bend in the road, every empty clearing. Psychological fear was intensified by the visual paradox. The Panthers, big, imposing, visually intimidating, were now avoided by smaller, more fragile and, by traditional standards, inferior vehicles. This created a cognitive dissonance. How could a machine with less armor and firepower win systematically? The answer lay in tactics, but for those being hunted, the explanation was irrelevant. The perception of inferiority was reversed. The Hellcats became hunters and the Panthers prey. And when the doctrine loses its psychological coherence, moral collapse sets in. In October 1944, American intelligence intercepted communications where German commanders asked for specific instructions on how to avoid areas with a Hellcat presence. It was no longer a matter of winning. It was an attempt to survive, a request that in itself was already a confession of defeat, because the true power of a weapon lies not just in what it destroys, but in what it stops the enemy from attempting. And at that point in the war, the Hellcat had turned entire forests into no-go zones. He had installed fear inside the German machine. This moral disintegration did not come from a single battle. It came from repetition of the standard, from the constant feeling that no matter how much they prepared, there was no plan that would survive the first invisible shot. German doctrine, with all its technical sophistication, had ignored the most volatile factor of war, the spirit of the combatant. And when that spirit bends, no steel protects it, no cannon saves him. The American victory began before the last shot. It began the moment the Panthers became afraid to walk. And yet, the Hellcat was not the pinnacle of American strength. It was just a part of her, because behind the scenes of these victories was another machine, an even bigger, quieter, and more decisive one, the U.S. logistics system. An industrial gear that not only replaced losses, but anticipated demands, delivered parts, moved entire divisions in days, while Germany still had fuel with maps and hope. It is in this next layer that victory changes scale, because speed, tactics, and psychology are weapons, but the real victory comes from those who control the backstage of the battlefield. While the Hellcats repositioned with new tactics each week, the German High Command remained stuck with a playbook that no longer applied to the 1944 battlefield. The doctrine of the blitzkrieg, fast, offensive, vertical, had been unbeatable in 1940, but now it collided with an adversary that not only understood its standards, but manipulated them. Reports coming from the front lines, especially after the fighting at Aracourt, warned of the inefficiency of German armored formations in fragmented terrain, the increasing lateral vulnerability of the Panthers, and the urgent need to readjust tactics to the realities of the Western theater. But these reports were often ignored or shelved. Official doctrine was still based on the almost dogmatic belief that the Panther was by nature superior to any Allied tank, so if there were flaws, they were attributed to local execution, never to the central concept. On the other side, the Americans did the opposite. When a Hellcat was lost in a specific situation, Buick engineers received reports within days. Field tests were carried out. Modifications were implemented on the assembly line in less than a week. The 76mm MA1 gun received recoil speed adjustments. The turret armor was slightly altered with bolt-on plates, easy to replace in the field. Crews gave direct feedback, and that feedback shaped tactical changes. In some units, Hellcats even began to operate with smoke grenades installed improvisedly on side supports, an adaptation created by field sergeants and immediately absorbed as a standard of operation. American doctrine was not a book. It was an ongoing conversation between industry, command, and combat. This contrast between rigidity and adaptation was also visible in industrial policy. While the Germans invested colossal resources to develop supertanks, such as the Maus and the Jagdtiger, true behemoths that required infrastructure, rare parts, and complex logistics, the Americans invested in modular production. One Hellcat used the same Wright R975 engine that was already mass-produced for other purposes. The transmission was standard. The wheels, the axles, the brakes, all adapted from existing components. There was no time for artisanal genius. There was urgency for replicable effectiveness, and this choice, apparently less noble, won. In September 1944, an internal directive from the German High Command ordered the use of Panthers as the main offensive force, even after multiple reports indicating mounting losses against lighter vehicles in tactical ambushes. This insistence was not just technical, it was ideological. To admit the need for change would be to admit that the doctrine of armored superiority was bankrupt, and for a regime that fed on myths of invincibility, this admission was impossible. The result? Panthers sent to repeat mistakes that had already been documented. Tanks designed to break lines were ambushed by vehicles that cost a third of the price and were produced at a rate 10 times higher. This dichotomy reached all the way up to the highest levels of the decision-making chain. Officers such as Guderian warned of the need to reassess industrial priorities, but their proposals clashed with Goebbels' propaganda, which sold the image of the supertank as a symbol of German resistance. Meanwhile, in the US, logistical decisions were made by committees made up of civil engineers, military strategists, and industry representatives. There was no ego, there was function. And the function was clear: to win fast with less efficiently. Modern warfare, after all, was no longer decided by the strongest tank, but by the most adaptable system. What was seen on the battlefield was a reflection of this contrast. Every time a Hellcat maneuvered around a Panther, fired and disappeared, it wasn't just a tactical victory. It was the demonstration of a superior logic of war. not by individual genius, but by collective intelligence. By a system that listened to its soldiers, learned from their mistakes and transformed adaptation into doctrine. While Germany tried to prove that it had created the perfect machine, the United States proved that perfection was not needed. It needed continuous adaptation. That was the real fatal dilemma. Germany believed in final machines. The US believed in living systems, in movements, on faults corrected in real time. The Hellcat wasn't just the product of that vision. It was his material proof, a vehicle that would never have won by brute force, but that, within a logic of constant learning, became invincible in what really mattered: initiative, reaction time, and mastery of the scenario. And in the next chapter of this story, we'll see how this American logic of adaptation escalated even further, connecting tanks, artillery, infantry, and the sky. Because the battlefield of World War II was about to receive a new layer, American air supremacy, and the Hellcat once again was at the center of it. Clear. Here is part 16 of 20, as requested. The Tiger. I was more than a tank. It was a symbol. German engineering in its purest form. 57 tons of steel, an 18mm gun with a reputation for legend, frontal armor that defied any direct fire. In 1943, his arrival at the front changed the course of battles. In 1944, in the forests of France, it began to lose meaning. The change wasn't in the gun, but it was in the field. While German generals relied on the brute force of their mobile fortresses, Americans had already understood a brutal truth. You don't beat the tiger by confronting it. It is won by annulling his presence even before he acts. And that's exactly what the M18 Hellcat went on to do. In real clashes, the sequence was almost repeated. A tiger appeared in the line of advance, escorted by infantry or other armored vehicles. In theory, nothing would stop him, except a side or rear shot at a favorable angle. But the Hellcats didn't expect a loophole. They created it. Using their absurd mobility, they positioned themselves minutes in advance, hidden behind depressions in the terrain, curves, ruins, or dense vegetation. When the tiger appeared, the ambush was already set. The first shot was not fired by reaction. It was fired in anticipation, and even if it didn't penetrate, the impact was disorienting. All it took was seconds. The tiger slowly rotated its 2-ton turret, searching for the target. But the Hellcat had already retreated, changed position, reappeared on another flank. The fortress was attacked by shadows. In one of the most emblematic episodes of the campaign in Lorraine, a single platoon of Hellcats zigzagged around 2 tigers, trying to cross a field partially covered in fog and burnt trees. The M18s fired, retreated, regrouped, attacked again. None of them were destroyed. The tigers were abandoned. One for mechanical failure, the other for fuel. What had seemed unthinkable months earlier, light tanks dictating the rules against armored monsters, now became recurrent. German doctrine was beginning to unravel not in destroyed tanks, but in immobilized tanks, not in the dead, but in those who have stopped advancing. Technical analysis reveals why. The Hellcat's gun, even lower than the 80mm at direct range, was sufficient to penetrate the sides and rears of the Tiger at common tactical distances, and the mobility of the M18 made it almost inevitable that these angles would be exploited. In the open field, Tiger had the advantage. But the Second World War at that point was no longer made of open fields. It was made up of villages, narrow roads, urban areas, dense forests, scenarios in which the speed of reaction was worth more than the thickness of the armor. And in that, Tiger lost them all. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them: a lighter, faster vehicle, easier to maintain and operate. But the German obsession with blind greatness did not allow us to admit that the future was in the simple, the adaptable, the coordinated. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts that don't make it into traditional books, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content and historical analysis like this one. By the end of 1944, the US Army had developed specific tactical manuals for dealing with tigers, and none of them involved direct confrontation. General Patton himself ordered tank destroyer units to avoid head-on dueling. The mission was different: to break the advance before the Tiger could fire, and it worked. The statistics bear it out. Most of the Tigers destroyed by Hellcats were not in direct combat, but on the move, maneuvering or attempting repositioning. They were hunted as large, slow-moving animals by smaller but much more cunning predators. The symbol of German terror had become a symbol of inefficiency, not because his engineering was bad, but because the war had already changed. And when the enemy changes paradigm and you insist on the same dogma, your greatest weapon becomes your greatest burden. With each Tiger lost, it was not just a material loss, it was a symbolic loss. And that symbol would begin to crumble in the next episode when the US force went from being just tactical or mechanical to something even harder to beat, a complete operational culture of networking, learning, and anticipation. And the Hellcats would be the first to pave the way for the next leap, full battlefield synchronization. After Aracourt, something changed, not just on battle maps, but in the way the American command interpreted armored warfare. The performance of the M18 Hellcat in that grey week of September 1944 was not seen as an isolated episode, but as a sign, a real prototype of the new war that was taking shape. If until then the Hellcats had been tactically inserted as a response, from then on they became elements of anticipation. The doctrine evolved. The light tank destroyer was employed as a spearhead for armed reconnaissance, advance interdiction, and flank cover, functions that had previously been the responsibility of heavier units, but were now better performed by a light, fast, and coordinated force. During the Battle of the Bulge, this change became visible. In the chaos of the Ardennes, with the German advance trying to fight their way through the snow and fog, the Hellcats moved with millimeter precision. Instead of reacting, they blocked it. Instead of pursuing, they anticipated. One of the most iconic examples occurred on the banks of the Urthe River, when a group of M18s crossed miles of uneven terrain and night ice to take position in a village before the arrival of a panzer column. The distance covered was greater than that of the Germans, but the Americans got there first. Because now, speed wasn't just an attribute, it was doctrine. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 reinforces this transition. With makeshift bridges being launched, the US Army could not afford to expect heavy armor. The Hellcat was the natural solution. Light enough to cross fragile structures, fast enough to flank and provide cover before the Germans reacted. In several reports, the M18 appears ahead of the infantry, something unthinkable at the beginning of the war. He was the one who cleaned, probed, identified targets. The logic was reversed. You didn't protect the Hellcat with infantry, you protected the infantry with Hellcats. The psychological impact of this change was profound. American officials began to see the M18 not as a tank destroyer, but as a field sensor, a mobile extension of tactical intelligence. Each platoon operated as advanced eyes, connected via radio and capable of changing the geometry of combat with minutes of advantage. In operations on German territory, there were cases where the Hellcats arrived before the artillery observers. This anticipation became a weapon, and the weapon became routine. The Germans, on the other hand, did not keep up with this acceleration. Even after Aracourt, they maintained their bet on heavy tanks, on conventional formations, on advances that depended on favorable terrain and stable supply, two things that no longer existed in 1945. The Tiger II, Germany's most advanced and feared armored vehicle, consumed more fuel than the convoys could deliver. His turret rotated too slowly to react to coordinated attacks. Its armor did not prevent the most serious loss of all, time, because while he was getting ready, the Hellcat was already behind him. The statistic that defines this moment is silent but brutal. Between December 1944 and April 1945, the US moved more than 2,300 M18 vehicles between different fronts, using the rail network, road transport, and even aerial trailers. By contrast, Germany produced just over 300 Panthers and 80 Tigers in the same period, not counting those that never made it to the front. The war had accelerated and Germany stood still. If this statistic surprises you, comment below with one word: speed wins. More than anything, the M18's performance between Aracourt and the end of the war cemented an undeniable truth. The modern battlefield belongs to those who move first, react faster, and learn faster. The enemy's technical superiority was irrelevant in the face of the American ability to apply, adapt, and replicate. Each successful ambush by a Hellcat was the living manifestation of this doctrine, a doctrine that didn't need the strongest tank, only the fastest system. But the Hellcat's legacy still had one last impact, because even after the war, when the battles ceased and the engines fell silent, the M18 would leave something deeper than destroyed enemy carcasses. He would leave an idea, the idea that war, like technology, favors those who break rules and create new ones. And this idea, more than any armored vehicle, would shape the next conflicts. In the next chapter, we'll reveal how the Hellcat experience inspired not just future doctrines, but a vision of warfare centered on networking, intelligence, and anticipation, where each unit is not just a weapon, but a real-time strategic decision. By the end of the war, the Hellcats had begun to disappear from European battlefields, not because they had failed, but because they had accomplished their mission, and, more importantly, because they had left a seed planted. The M18's true heritage wasn't its gun, its speed, or its lightweight silhouette. It was the logic he brought, a logic that would reverse the course of military thought in the 20th century. The Hellcat proved that survival could come in another way, from the impossibility of being hit, mobility as a shield, of the information network as invisible armor, and this concept would grow, quietly, but definitively. In the years that followed, as the world split between NATO and Warsaw Pact, doctrinal studies on both sides examined Aracourt, Bastogne, and other battles where the M18 excelled, and the conclusion was repeated. The success of the Hellcat came less from its weapon and more from its context. He was part of something bigger, a network of quick decision-making, fast logistical support, multi-layered coordination. The tank for the first time was understood as a node in a system, and not as an isolated entity. This vision would shape the concepts that, decades later, would give rise to the M1 Abrams in the United States, the Leopard 2 in Germany, and the Merkava in Israel, all focusing not only on firepower, but on situational awareness, integration, and dynamic mobility. The not being hit has become doctrine. The reactive armor, early warning systems, thermal sensors, and 360-degree radars that today equip the world's leading MBTs are direct heirs to a philosophy that began with the M18. More than that, the ability to operate in a network, to act with agility, to modulate the use of force according to the terrain and the threat, all this echoes the first experiments of Manual 18-5, the same one that taught the Hellcats to move as hunters and not as walls. The future of armored warfare had been foreseen by a tank destroyer who, ironically, disliked frontal battles. An internal US Army report, published in 1946 and kept private for years, literally stated, "Aracourt's greatest lesson was not technical, but philosophical. Success came from an adaptive system, not an invulnerable vehicle." This phrase would become the foundation for the development of the air-land battle doctrine in the 1980s, when the United States redesigned its entire land strategy around agility, integration, and anticipation, concepts forged, albeit discreetly, in light tank-occupied France in 1944. Even the Bundeswehr, the West German army, recognized this. In the 1950s, in restructuring their armored doctrine under NATO supervision, a number of German generals incorporated tactics based on speed, radio networks, and interarms coordination, the same ones they had faced and underestimated 10 years earlier. It was an implicit confession that the past had gone wrong and that the future needed to learn from it. Irony, once again, imposes itself. The machine that the Germans mocked for looking fragile has become the doctrinal skeleton of modern combat. The vehicle that seemed too simple to be feared has become the invisible predecessor of the world's most complex battle platforms. The Hellcat wasn't the pinnacle of technology, it was the beginning of a quiet revolution. And real revolutions, as the forgotten books of history show, rarely come with fanfare. They arrive as the M18 arrived, fast, unexpected, and impossible to stop. But before the war was over, and before the Hellcat retired from the battlefield, there would be a final moment, a symbolic operation, where all this logic, this doctrine, this new philosophy of warfare would condense into a single tactical action, a confrontation where the last gasp of German armored arrogance would collide with American operational maturity, a moment that would serve as an epitaph and signature at the same time, the real last hunt. And it is exactly this episode that we will reveal now. When the dust of World War II settled, the world began to count its heroes. Tiger became a legend, the Sherman has become a symbol, and the M18 Hellcat, it disappeared into the dim light of collective memory. Not for lack of achievements, but for excessive silence. He didn't fit the traditional archetype of the glorious machine. It was too light, too fast, too functional to fit into the heavy aesthetic that cinema and books preferred. The iconography of war needed slow, noisy tanks that collided in head-on duels. The Hellcat, with its appearance and disappearance tactic, was too fast even for the narrative. American veterans who served in the Hellcat units remember, with a mixture of pride and frustration, that their weapon was never celebrated like the others. Many report the feeling of being part of something efficient but invisible. At ex-combatant meetings, it was common for Hellcat pilots to be mistaken for Sherman operators, as if the M18 was just one tank among many. The truth is, he didn't look like a tank. It was low, without heavy side armor, with a turret that rotated as if it was out of place. Its impact, however, was of the first magnitude. On the German side, the silence was even thicker. Post-war reports from the Wehrmacht avoid going into detail about the clashes against the Hellcats. In part, because many officers simply did not know what had hit them. In part, it was difficult to accept that vehicles tactically considered inferior had methodically dismantled an entire philosophy of war built on steel and pride. In interviews decades later, officers such as Siegfried Westphal and Hermann Balck mention American fast groups that appeared on the flanks, without naming them. It was a subtle confession of impotence. To admit the Hellcat would be to admit that modern warfare had been won not by force but by intelligence applied at scale. In museums, the space given to the M18 is modest. In the movies, almost non-existent. The Hellcat didn't yield epic images. It didn't participate in the classic scenes of ruined duels, nor did it offer the kind of armored vehicles that directors love to put on screen. He passed too fast to be captured. His story has become legend only in the most attentive circles of military history, those who study not what shines but what works. The final irony? The most lethal weapon in the Aracourt camps was also the least portrayed in the post-war period. And yet, when the armies of the world began to re-evaluate their doctrines, the Hellcat was there, not in pictures, but in manuals, not in movies, but between the lines of strategies. His name may have disappeared from the mouths of the general public, but his logic has taken deep root. The idea that a gun needs to be part of a system, that mobility is worth more than armor, and that winning is anticipating, it all started there, with American workers assembling tracked chassis in Detroit. Hellcat didn't want fame. I wanted results. This lack of media recognition generated a second layer of oblivion, the difficulty of casual historians in explaining the collapse of the Panzerwaffe at the end of the war. After all, how to understand that the Tigers and Panthers, icons of superiority, have been defeated by something almost anonymous? The answer is exactly there, because real revolutions rarely come dressed in glory. They come disguised as a function. And the Hellcat was, perhaps, the most functional vehicle of the entire war, at the most critical moment against the most prepared enemy. In post-war gatherings, veterans from both sides sometimes met again. Documented accounts show moments when former German commanders would ask directly, "What kind of tank was that attacked us from the sides and disappeared?" And the American response was always the same. "It wasn't a tank, it was a fighter." This seemingly simple sentence reveals the whole paradigm shift. The Hellcat did not participate in the war like the others. He hunted, but history has a peculiar way of correcting its own omissions. In recent years, with the advancement of technical research and access to declassified military documents, the role of the M18 has begun to be revalued. More than a museum piece, it is now understood as a turning point, a divider between the old and the new. The reminder that sometimes what seems minor is precisely what changes everything. And this recognition, although belated, sets the stage for the last part of this narrative. Because there is a question that still echoes. What would have happened if the Germans had understood earlier what they were facing? And the answer to this question may not lie in the numbers, but in the silence that came after. The collapse of the German armored doctrine was not due to an explosion, but to a constant erosion, a methodical erosion brought about by something they never foresaw: American systemic superiority. The fall was not caused by a more powerful weapon, but by a more modern logic. While Germany relied on steel, the United States relied on nets. While the German generals sought mechanical perfection, the Americans bet on adaptation. And it was this choice, for speed, for fluidity, for production on a scale, that sealed the fate of a doctrine that had already been born, stuck in the past. The M18 Hellcat didn't just destroy Panthers and Tigers. He destroyed a belief, the belief that war could be won by rigidity. The real American victory was not in the guns, but in the system that put guns in the right place, at the right time. with the right crew. Modern warfare belongs not to the strongest, but to the fastest in learning, adapting, and evolving. That's the ultimate lesson. Tanks don't win wars. Ideas win. Logistics wins. Scale wins. Mobility wins. And above all, the ability to change. General Heinz Guderian, creator of the Blitzkrieg, would admit years later, "We were defeated by an industry that thought faster than we did." If you value in-depth historical research based on facts, data, and strategic analysis, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This helps us to continue producing content that is serious, honest, and committed to the truth. And tell us in the comments, what was the most surprising fact about this story? Activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact, because the next story is even more unexpected. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.